All right, Cameron, welcome to the show, my friend.
Boomer, thanks for having me, man.
So you're joining us from lovely Arkansas, which the weather here in Amsterdam today feels like Arkansas. And for those watching this on the YouTube channel, they may notice that I start sweating. That's because I'm in the box that is my podcast studio. But today we're going to be talking about just one of my favorite topics because it's something I've struggled with my entire life, but specifically how to deal with it. And that's anxiety. Um, I've experimented with kava for probably about 8 years now. And when I was looking at, in doing my own research, there's a lot of just esoteric publications out there and people's opinions around kava. And then I met you, Cameron, and I finally found somebody that I have a degree of confidence in terms of being able to explain the story to people. So thank you for taking the time today.
Oh, absolutely. I love this topic. So,
So for those that are sitting here and asking, hey, Boomer, are you doing an episode on the Spanish version of champagne? Can we just talk about what is kava?
right, yes. Kava is a stress relieving nootropic elixir, traditional kava is, that's produced from the roots of a shrub like plant that grows in the South Pacific islands called Piper methysticum. And the word Piper methysticum literally means intoxicating pepper because this plant is in the pepper family. So it's got these beautiful heart shaped leaves, and basically the roots of this shrub have been used for over 3,000 years in islands like Fiji and this island chain called Vanuatu right off the coast of Fiji. Tonga, Papua New Guinea, even Hawaii. It's been used for over 3,000 years there. Um, as a stress relieving preparation that's used in a lot of the same contexts that like we use alcohol, say in the West, but also in the same context that we use coffee. It's a very sort of social enhancing anxiolytic substance.
Hmm.
It helps people loosen up. It helps people connect. It helps people get into a state of, introspective and creative thinking as well too. Which is part of why people are drawn to it. So it has, this amazing effects profile. But then as you start to dive into some of the scientific literature that's been vetted out on kava over the last 20 years, which kava is one of the most well-studied herbs on the planet outside of cannabis, ginseng, and some of these other ones. There's been a lot of publications on it. Once you start to dive into that, you find out that there are many, many other sort of adjunctive mechanisms that kava provides and therapeutic effects that kava provides that work at all different levels of human biology, which is not that dissimilar from so many other, what we see with cannabis, what we see with adaptogenic herbs, right? They have their effects that they're most popular for, in this case stress relief, but then we have all these other effects too, all these other systems in the body as well. But anyways, traditional kava in these islands is a drink preparation that's prepared specifically with certain parts of the plant, meaning
Hmm.
the roots of the plant are the only parts that are consumed. The above ground portions of the plant, these leaves and the stems, contain plant defense alkaloids that are actually mildly toxic to human beings. So they're
Hmm.
not consumable. Indigenous people found this out hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. So they take the roots basically in these islands and they grind down the roots, and then they put them sort of in a strainer bag and they knead them into a bowl of cold water or hot water in some cases. And they produce this sort of full spectrum sort of Kavalactone matrix drink where these active constituents called Kavalactones sort of come to the surface, and it's like a suspension because they're not water soluble. So they come, to the top of the drink, and then that's consumed in all these contexts, in weddings, funerals, spiritual ceremonies, social gatherings, all of
Every
these
single day, right?
contexts. Basically, yes. I mean, so in Vanuatu, like 80 or 90% of the population is consuming it daily, in varying degrees and dosages. But it's a core fundamental part of living in these islands. It's a core fundamental part of the social fabric of all of these islands too. So it's a very, over there to them, it's really their most sacred commodity. And like in Vanuatu, it's like their number one, number two export. So it's very, very common, obviously, over in the islands, and virtually not even known throughout many other places in the world in this form. There are other
Hmm.
forms that we can talk about that have made their way into the marketplace that aren't quite the same, still sort of under, a similar umbrella, but there's definitely differences there.
Yeah, so let's connect some dots here, right? So Cameron, you are in Arkansas right now, which
Yeah.
is a hell of a long way from Vanuatu. Vanuatu, for everybody that didn't remember what Cameron just said, near Fiji, near New Zealand. Let's connect some dots for people here. How did you become interested in kava, and how did that, I mean, I guess it led to Vanuatu via the kava,
Yeah.
but how did kava come into your life?
Yeah, for me, I always call my story kind of a pain to purpose story. I mean, most of the discoveries that I made, the reason that I'm in the industry that I'm in right now, doing the things that I'm doing, really all came out of my own pain. It came out of me developing a pretty severe autoimmune, sort of neurotoxic driven illness in my early 20s.
Which
That was
autoimmune condition was it, or was it
Well,
something?
it was difficult to get a diagnosis. It was one of those that just sort of exploded, that I got many different diagnoses,
Hmm.
from, from lupus to Crohn's.
The diagnosis X. We just
Yes,
gonna,
exactly.
yeah.
It
Okay.
was it was just, the underlying autoimmune process, and a lot of times these diagnoses are just correlate to symptom clusters, so that you can be given a corresponding medication through the allopathic model. But really, the autoimmune process is consistent throughout all of these conditions. And for me, it was to a degree that it was manifesting on my skin and my brain, and my circulatory system, my liver, the whole thing. And so I really had kind of a complete breakdown of my health that came from uh, many different environmental factors and stressors, toxic exposures,
Hmm.
bad reactions to medications, and just
Hmm.
genetic susceptibility. It was just one of these situations that I call the perfect storm, right? Whenever you
Yep.
have susceptibility in place, you've got some toxic lifestyle circumstances, and then maybe a huge emotional trauma and a combination of things, and just the bottom falls out. And at the
So,
time,
okay, let's talk about that bottom
Mhm.
falling out, because you and
Yeah,
I have chatted before, and that bottom falling out took you some very interesting places before you arrived at Kava. What
yes.
were, if you don't mind just hinting at a couple of those places, and what were the things that you were trying?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the bottom fell out in my early 20s. I was about 20 years old, and I had had some egregious circumstances and some different, uh, you know, toxic circumstances leading up to that. But at the time, I was an extremely functional, 20, 21-year-old kid, and I was working multiple jobs, and I was, a competitive athlete here in the NCAA in the United States, a distance runner and, triathlete, all those things. And so I was also putting an enormous amount of stress on my body with those sports, and I kind of had an
Yep.
abusive relationship with it that was based more on performance than it was longevity.
Yep.
So all those things came to a head. I ended up in a psychiatrist's office. I was prescribed a whole host of pharmaceuticals, the main one being amphetamines, Adderall, which that was the thing that sort of was the icing on the cake that sort of wiped out a very vulnerable system that was already quite depleted.
Hmm.
So the bottom basically fell out at that point. And I got extremely sick over the next couple of years, and basically cut to, a year, 2 years later, I was completely handicapped, couldn't leave my home, was having all kinds of severe cognitive deficits, digestive issues, severe reactions to foods and supplements and all this kind of stuff. So that sort of started me on the odyssey of sort of, I had really no choice but to sort of spend some time in introspection, as well as go into scouring medical and scientific literature. And I was already someone who was kind of prone to that, to sort of finding answers for myself, because I had exhausted the whole allopathic model at this point. And I sort of made the rounds and traveled around to different physicians and healthcare providers and such, to accumulating knowledge about different treatments, therapies, modalities, lifestyle changes. And it was just sort of this process of trying to assimilate all of these different things that I was learning into a multi-therapeutic approach that was a system that I could navigate.
Hmm.
And that's how I got integrated into this world of sort of functional medicine and stuff, and eventually started working in it. I came across a couple individuals. One of my mentors, Dr. Dan Pompa, who's he's a chiropractor
Yeah.
here in the United States. um, and he sort of coached me in a process that he calls true cellular detox, and that
Yeah.
was sort of the core of how I got my life back, navigating that, different dietary changes, targeted supplementation, and then the icing on the cake, I did a lot of different regenerative modalities like stem cells. I've traveled around doing stuff like that. And so it was this combination of things that over time got me better. But when I was in the midst of my process, though, I had a, well, I I was, one of my main symptoms that I was having were like severe convulsions. I was having like multiple seizures a day and crazy reactions and stuff. And I was
Wow.
on these heavy doses of benzodiazepines to try to control those things, these bad reactions and stuff. So that was becoming a problem pretty quick because, as I sort of referred to earlier, drugs were a problem for me. And that was sort of, one of the factors that destroyed my system to begin with, and sort of the addiction and the dependency and stuff. And the benzos were having some terrible effects on my brain. They were having some terrible effects on me from a personality standpoint, as well as I was getting highly dependent on them, obviously very fast, and was completely dependent on them. And there's a tolerance too. They weren't even doing much for me anymore, but I couldn't just go off them because you go into severe withdrawal. That's sort of one of the silent epidemics, that's going on right now, is just benzodiazepine
Benzos
addiction.
are a huge epidemic, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're probably second only to opiates, but
Yep.
any person who's been through that process would tell you, who's been through both, who's been through addiction of both opiates and benzos, that benzos can, and many times is worse when it
Yeah.
comes to the withdrawal symptoms. They absolutely can kill you. They can bring you into severe life-threatening seizures and heart attacks and strokes and all this stuff. It's just a horrible experience to go through. So, we're starting to get into this sort of mentality, I guess, this sort of understanding around that particular class of drugs, where physicians are very, very hesitant to prescribe them. Even the most mainstream secular allopathic physicians who go straight and only to drugs um, are becoming really hesitant to prescribe them for any more than short-term acute sort of interventions to, like, severe panic attacks, because the drawbacks just aren't worth it.
Oh yeah.
Uh, so I kind of got down this road, and I was actually working with Dr. Pompa at the time, and he was trying to coach me through some different protocols and things. Um, and the problem was I couldn't tolerate anything. I couldn't tolerate supplements. I couldn't tolerate foods. My nervous system was so fragile, and I was getting progressively worse because of these benzodiazepines that was on. And I was going to start going, because they had reached their maximum efficacy. And there comes a point where you stop getting effects, and then if you don't keep increasing your dose, you start getting a ricochet effect, and if you go off of it, then it gets really bad. So we had to find an off ramp off of these drugs, right? Because it was just, they were holding me back, right? I mean, I couldn't, first of all, I couldn't tolerate anything, and my convulsions were really bad, so I needed to find something else anyways. So what I was looking for at this point, I had developed a sort of intimate understanding of the difference between sort of synthetic pharmacology and plant pharmacology.
Hmm.
Synthetic pharmacology meaning, pharmaceuticals are usually single compounds, like a benzodiazepine, a single molecule that has a very linear action in the body, right?
Yep.
Which is great for therapeutic, for acute therapeutic application. If you need, general or, local anesthesia, for a surgery, if you need an acute, an antibiotic or something like that, then that's a good option in certain circumstances. But the problem with that is because they have a singular mechanism, it's not part of the body's sort of signaling sequence, or
Hmm.
the complete, what we call the innate intelligence of the body. And so the body doesn't recognize it. It's sort of like you have an assembly line and you try to intervene at one step, like 3 steps down the assembly line, and it throws off the whole thing. That's kind of what can happen with drugs, is the body says, whoa, this is not part of our system. It starts to downregulate the very system that you're trying to stimulate with the drug. In the case of benzos, they work on the main calming system of the body. It's the GABA system.
Hmm.
Um, and basically what you get is you get a downregulation and a depletion of that system, which leads to the tolerance, dependency, and withdrawal symptoms. So it's sort of like you're using up your bank account of available GABA and all the different processes around it.
Hmm.
Plant pharmacology. So what I was looking for when I was looking for an alternative to a benzodiazepine was something out of the plant or fungal kingdom that delivered and bound to the same receptors as a benzo.
Hmm.
So that could get me through the withdrawal process hopefully easier, as well as start to give me some of the therapeutic effects I was getting in the beginning, but without creating that sort of ricochet response, right? Because plant compounds have what we call the entourage effect, which is they have a multitude of different synergistic active compounds that sort of work as a living system, just like the cells in our body or the active signals in our body as well. It's a living system, and there's all these different steps of the system, and it all balances itself out. There's an intelligence behind it, in other words, right? So plants are the same way. That's why many times with plants, we sort of all intuitively know that if it's a plant, it's going to be safer in your body. It's going to be more biologically compatible, usually, unless it happens to be a toxic plant or something. But when we talk about things that have been used medicinally for a long time, we're talking about plants that usually have therapeutic action that is, synchronizes more with the body's, biological processes.
Hmm.
So basically, that's what I was looking for. I was looking for an analog or a replacement, but something that was more complex, that didn't give me the addiction, dependency, and withdrawal symptoms. And I didn't know if I was going to find it, honestly, because, I'm thinking I've tried so many different plant compounds, and usually, they're just not as strong. I mean, there's cannabis over here, but that didn't work for me. It doesn't bind to the same systems, made me more paranoid, had a lot of different,
Yep.
effects that were too psychoactive. And then you've got a whole host of other different herbs like chamomile, valerian root, passion flower, lemon balm, these kind of things that you can find in every health food store that just, I mean, there's something. I mean, I like those herbs, and they all do interact with this GABA system, but in such a subtle way that it was sort of like, for me, trying to use those to get off benzodiazepines was like trying to take down an elephant with a BB gun kind of thing. It was like it just wasn't happening, right? It was like,
Hmm.
they're helpful, but it's just not nearly enough. So at the time, like, say, I was doing Dr. Pompous protocols and things. And so we were talking about this, and I had already been doing research for years and years, right? And so I had sort of found my way and, around the scientific literature, also as far as, you know, philosophically understood the idea behind plant medicine and sort of how to
Hmm.
navigate this world of the ethnobotanical community as well.
Hmm.
So what I was looking for was this analog, and going through the literature and looking at all of the different known compounds out of nature that do bind to these receptors, you're going to come across kava because it's known as one of the all stars.
Yep.
But as I started to go through this list, I had already tried what I thought was kava before, at the beginning of my illness, before I even ever got on benzos. And I really just went to the health food store and picked up
The Yogi
a
Tea Kava.
yes, exactly, like a yogi tea kava, or like or these other companies that are there that you just get like capsules or powders or tinctures, and or yeah, the tea bags there.
Hmm.
And I picked up that, and it wasn't like it was nothing, but it wasn't that impressive at all. So I had kind of shelved it. So now cut to when I'm back in this horrible, benzodiazepine addiction process and trying to scour for a replacement, I was kind of like, I've already looked at that. I mean, people even told me I should give it another look, and I was like, I've already tried it. It's not that big of a deal. But intuitively, I just decided, well, maybe there's something more here, because whenever you read some of the anthropological accounts, when you read a lot of the historical accounts, and you even read in the literature, there are effects that were being reported from kava use that I did not experience with those store-bought products. And I'm like, there's a disconnect here, because I started to read about and talk to people from Vanuatu. I got in contact with a supplier who connected me with a bunch of farmers and indigenous people, and started to sort of accumulate the story behind kava. And to me, it was just, there was this huge disconnect between what I had experienced and what they were experiencing, right?
Yeah.
So I decided to give it a try, because one of the indigenous people I was talking to, I told them, well, I've tried this and I've tried that. And they're like, no, you haven't tried kava. So they started sending me some of the dried root that was, well, actually some of the fresh root too, that they had, ground down, that was still fresh, that was just denatured. They sent it to me with a bunch of instructions of how to prepare it traditionally, right? Which was
So
like,
this is like a matcha almost experience, like a traditional matcha ceremony kind of thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very similar to that. Yeah. So
Hmm.
they Right. So I was given instructions on how to prepare it through the strainer bag in the water, and it was a really tedious process. Took like 30 minutes sometimes to squeeze the stuff out. It was like it got my strainer bag all nasty. It got this like film that's in there, which is like the Kavalactones, but it also got all these tannins and root fibers and stuff. And I ended up with a very, I mean, it was a messy process that took time, but then at the very end, you end up with this big bowl of what looks and tastes like muddy water, right? Which at the time I was perfectly happy to drink, right? Because but well, that's a problem whenever you're trying to, reach a lot of people with it, as we'll talk about. But right, so I started preparing it and I started consuming it, and immediately I knew that it was different. But yeah, after consuming it for like 1 to 2 weeks, I was like, whoa, I'm like super impressed by this. This is like really amazing because my reactions and convulsions within like probably about 4 weeks were reduced by like up to like 80 or 85%. Like
Wow.
it was astounding. Like I was like, it was giving me therapeutic action that that the benzodiazepine drugs, Xanax, Klonopin, the ones I was on, were not even coming close to giving me.
Hmm.
And it wasn't giving me this tolerance effect that happens almost immediately with the benzos. And so there was this period of time, and so it's like, there was this short period of time where I was able to get off regular use of these things, within like 1 to 2 months maximum. Really, it was around 2 months, which is sort of unheard of in this class of drugs. I mean, tapering from these things, for some people, is like near impossible if their system is fragile enough. And whenever people do it successfully, it takes a year usually minimum. They've been on them for years,
Yeah.
sometimes a year and a half, 2 years. So I was just at that point, I was completely just blown away by the effects and started to dive into it fully from there.
So just a quick question here before we delve into the next part of this, but the tolerance level with kava, has it built up over the years, or are you still kind of at that similar first experience, if you will, in terms of the amount that you take every day?
That's a great question. Kava is really unique in that way. You know, Kava's, you know, pharmacology is very complex, and there's a lot that we don't fully understand about it yet on
Hmm.
why some of these experiential phenomena occur. One of the experiences that indigenous people have always reported on, that's well documented in the anthropological accounts and it's not fully accounted for in the scientific literature, is a phenomenon called reverse tolerance.
Okay.
So it's well known by kava users, and this is something that really only happens with this traditional preparation. I can explain why as well. But basically, what happens with kava is that, unlike a pharmaceutical, like if I take a benzodiazepine or if I take Adderall, if I take a street drug, I'm going to get the most prominent effects the first time I take it.
Yep.
Nothing's like that first time. The biggest high or the biggest whatever you're trying to get from it, therapeutic
Hmm.
effects, and then tolerance starts to ensue because, like I said, the system realizes it's there. You start to deplete it. You start to downregulate, and so you get less and less of an effect. You start to get this neurotransmitter resistance, right? You start to build up this resistance, which is tolerance. With kava, it's well known that as you start to take it, you get the least effects the first time you take it, and you get this cumulative effect as it starts to build up in your
Hmm.
system, and there's this sort of crescendoing effect that ensues over probably about the first 1 to 2 months until it sort of reaches a peak, and then it stays very consistent.
Okay.
Um, so it's really, really amazing. What's been proposed is that there's been some, a couple nuggets of evidence to suggest that there might be some increase in GABA receptor density over
Okay.
this long-term use and upregulation of the GABA system as well, sort of, bringing up the parasympathetic nervous system. So it seems to be having this rehabilitative effect on that system, as well, in addition to sort of the acute, therapeutic effect that it's giving you. But but yes, so that, for me, my experience with it has been that, as soon as you build it up and reach that therapeutic level, you never have to build up again. It's only in the beginning. And
Okay.
then it stays very consistent. It's one of those things that keeps working. Sometimes if you use one strain for too long, it'll keep working, but the effects will dull a tad bit. And so
Yeah.
if you cycle the strain, then you'll get full effects, and then you cycle back to that strain and it's working completely again. But no matter what, even if you use the same strain, it's not something that loses its effectiveness, which is something that's one of its best characteristics, in my opinion.
Amazing. So when you plug in Kava to the Google machine, right? Uh, of course, if you go to a site like Examine, it's one of the top recommendations for dealing with things like anxiety. But if you go into Google, inevitably you're going to come across some websites advocating for a hepatic toxicity of Kava, because historically there has been concerns raised, which actually resulted in bans in a number of different countries, particularly in Europe. But can we talk about that hepatic toxicity issue? Because I'm sure that there's somebody listening, and due to the conversations that I've had over the years about kava, there's probably somebody listening here with a little bit of skepticism and a little bit of questioning, okay, why the hell are we talking about kava when there's a hepatic toxicity issue? Is hepatic toxicity actually an issue with kava?
So the answer to that question depends totally on context. And this is why this has been an enigma, or had been an enigma, for a period of time. But with traditional kava, it's basically settled. So this is really the most important conversation that we can have around kava, because like you said, it's like, why even bother if it's toxic, or why even go down that road if we shouldn't be taking it at all? Um, you know, in all these circumstances, pretty much every plant medicine, big plant medicine that's, you know, sort of circulating through our culture right now, and some of the ones that aren't even circulating so much yet or completely yet, all the big ones. So, you know, we're kind of in the middle of like a plant renaissance almost, where we have, the
Amen.
legalization of cannabis, and you've got, we're making a rediscovery a lot of a lot of these very powerful plant compounds that have been used by indigenous people around the world for thousands of years, and that have been misunderstood due to lack of context in a conversation,
Mhm.
knee-jerk reactions, belief systems being developed, pushed by governments, and then it's just repeated, and most people just sort of parrot that without actually examining the initial set of evidence that hovered around the situation, trying to decide, okay, what context here? Is it good in all circumstances? Is it bad in all circumstances? A lot of these powerful plant medicines are tools, and if you use the tool incorrectly, it's like a hammer. You can build a
Mhm.
house with it, or you can hit yourself in the face with it, kind of thing. And so context matters in all these circumstances, just like we've learned with, in the cannabis world. There's a huge difference whenever we say, whenever we even say the word cannabis. What are we talking about? Are we talking about CBD oil that's
Are we
pure
talking
100%
about
just
Delta 9
isolate?
THC, or are we
Yeah,
talking about,
exactly.
yeah,
Or are we talking about
THCV, all that stuff?
dabs of, that's, of, 30-1 hybridized, sort of like denatured, like, THC concentrate? Like, it's all cannabis. It's all
Yeah.
cannabis sativa or indica, most likely. So that's kind of what's going on with kava as well, too, is just like with cannabis, there's a huge spectrum of different preparations, forms, and quality that's going to dictate your outcome, right?
Mhm.
So just like with the situation with cannabis, it's like, if I mean, even the negative effects that were there have been sort of over exaggerated, obviously, and prohibition. There's a whole story behind that, but there are some concerns, obviously, in certain contexts. But then we can't just blanket that and say, well, let's just prohibit it and just sort of deny any of its medicinal application based on that. Now, with kava, kava is far, far more benign and well tolerated by light years than cannabis. Kava's reputation issues really are all quality based, and toxicity based, in the context of it all came from one circumstance that occurred back in Germany and Switzerland back in the early 2000s, 2000 to 2002. There were a small set of studies that were unpacked using one pharmaceutical product that was produced by one pharmaceutical company that was trying to make kava into a drug, was trying to do what a lot of companies are trying to do. They're trying to find the medicine in it, and they're trying to extract that medicine
And
and then
patent it
yes,
and do all
exactly,
that
put it
stuff.
into a
Yeah.
patentable preparation. And the problem is sometimes as researchers and scientists, we get a little bit ahead of ourselves, because we get really caught up in our knowledge, and we get disconnected from our wisdom a little bit, right? Meaning that there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Wisdom is sort of intuitive, and it allows you to look at past experiences and see the big picture behind things on not just can you do something, but should you, or is it the most complete way of doing something? Is it wise in the long term?
Yep.
Knowledge is being able to take a plant, isolate certain compounds, look at under electron microscope or some, sort of lab analysis, and then create a preparation on it and get effects. And that's what a lot of pharma companies are trying to do. So in this circumstance, this was sort of at the precipice of what was about to be a huge kava boom in the world, because it was just now really making it out into the West, into Europe, becoming popular. And this company was trying to get a preparation that was pure Kavalactones, which are those active constituents. And they didn't pay homage or really pay close attention to how kava had been used safely for thousands of years in these islands. They were just looking for the active constituents and said, okay, we're going to make a preparation on it. And then it ended up so they made this preparation, and, they gave it to, a series of, patients and subjects, and, a collection of studies, who most of which were actually already liver compromised because they were coming off of alcohol, which is why they were taking part in the studies to begin with. They were on high doses of acetaminophen, many of them. There were all these different confounding variables that weren't controlled that made them vulnerable. And this product that they produced was not with the traditional preparation method at all. It was a solvent-based extract. And, a lot of their preparations were done with egregious solvents like acetone and things, it was believed. In which, obviously some of the solvent, up to 20%, can be left back in the final preparation. But whenever you use aggressive solvents with kava, it concentrates and dissolves a lot of the most active constituents, but leaves some of the some of the supportive constituents that create this balance in the body that I spoke of. So we can't expect to get the same effects and the same safety profile out of something that we've now turned into a pharmaceutical. So, a good way to understand this is you can't isolate caffeine from, coffee arabica from the coffee bean and call it coffee, right?
Yeah.
You can't take a caffeine pill and call it coffee. There are many people who go into the ER from overdosing on caffeine pills. Some people die from taking synthetic caffeine in massive dosages if they're susceptible. But that's really not happening with coffee, because coffee is the living constituent mixture. The same thing could be said in a stronger form of coca tea. If you go to Peru, you can consume coca tea, and it has medicinal value, and they use it regularly, and no one's robbing convenience stores, and no one's losing their life over the weekend. If you isolate the main active constituent from it and turn it into a synthetic compound, which is cocaine, then we know what happens, right? It turns
There's numerous wars.
Yes, exactly. So that was the situation. So this company got a hold of some not so good preparation methods, but also in addition to that, this conversation has been vetted out for the last 15 years, because basically what happened in the studies is they gave it to some people who were susceptible. It hurt some people who had some cases of liver toxicity, even a few cases of liver failure. And then there was this huge media campaign around it that just exploded. And even though it was just in this one small circumstance, once media got a hold of it, once regulatory agencies got a hold of it in a few countries, they just started parroting and mirroring each other. And we ended up with kava bans around the world. But the scientific community sort of, it was an enigma. Like in the US, it was never banned due to insufficient evidence, right? For example, there was just a disclaimer that was issued. So, right. So basically it's been unpacked over the last 15 years, and it's been well looked at by the scientific community. And so much so now what we know is that basically this company got involved and, sourced their kava material from some unscrupulous farmers who were most likely selling them their waste product, which is the above ground portions of the plant I mentioned earlier with all the toxic alkaloids in them. They weren't getting specific daily use strains that we call noble varieties. It's a classification term, and they're more domestic forms of kava that have been dialed in for daily use. And they use these solvent extractions. So they're taking these extra plant defense alkaloids and super concentrating in them. So they're like making a pharmaceutical plant defense alkaloid product. And so you end up with something that you can't call it kava, and no more than I can call a caffeine pill coffee. So what happened is that was believed to be what caused this circumstance that has never been demonstrated outside of that context and has never been observed in 3,000 years of daily traditional kava use.
Yeah.
There's virtually no accounts of liver toxicity or even chronic health issues at all, or anything but good health outcomes in these populations from taking kava. So the evidence was so overwhelming that even the World Health Organization issued a statement back in 2010. Well, one there and then one in 2014. Basically saying that this was a quality control issue, and if you this whole situation in Europe, and if you adhere to traditional preparation methodologies, that kava has been shown to be a safe food-like substance that has been used for this period of time in the islands, right? So and there's no evidence in the ethnopharmacological data that it's not. So that was their position on it. We are in the process, and have been for the last few years, of working with some of the leading researchers both in Vanuatu and in Europe that help sort of vet all of this process out over the last 15 years to develop and it has been submitted, and the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is a subset of the WHO that sets sort of quality standards for for products in the world, is in the process of adopting this proposal that was created for an international quality standard. It's expected to be adopted by the end of this year or early next year, that lays out all these criteria. It has to be traditional preparation methods, no solvent extraction, blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't mean that all products that don't meet those are even necessarily dangerous, because if you don't get the aerial parts, then it still may be pretty safe with solvent extraction, but we don't know. There's a question mark around it. So basically, the quality standard is going to dictate if it meets these criteria to be considered to be the definition of traditional kava, then you're going to be able to get food classification in many countries around the world, because many regulatory agencies are going behind that. So, which is going to be great. So it's going to be a situation where you might be able to get food classification here, just like coffee. So the situation has really been completely vetted out. Right now, it's just the idea around liver toxicity is just a relic of a dogmatic process that happens any times that a regulatory agency and government gets a hold of something. The best sort of comparison to this is like what happened with certain amino acids in the United States, tryptophan. This happened with tryptophan back in 1990, 1991, where one company developed a product, a synthetic product that was supposed to be tryptophan, that was produced incorrectly and then had some neurotoxins in it. So it wasn't chemically tryptophan, and it killed some people. And so then the regulatory agencies come back and they're like, okay, so now we're going to ban tryptophan. It's like, wait a minute. That'd be like, my buddy was telling me, or, on an interview the other day, someone was comparing it to, it's like, well, if we ban meat because someone sold something that wasn't meat, and it hurt some people, right? So at this point, it's dogmatic, and unfortunately, it's integrated into some of our information systems, and there's still this belief system out there. But it's been well settled in the scientific community and even the main regulatory bodies. So
Beautiful, and thank you for explaining that. I really hope that this process accelerates, because, for instance, I mean, here in the Netherlands, I can still get it. It's not technically something I should be able to get, but the process, it appears to be very slow to repeal these things. You see this in various other spaces as well, where we've banned certain exogenous substances, and despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence to repeal those bans, or that some of the original claims are not true, or some other products out there are actually more harmful than the products that were banned, it just seems like the bureaucracy of it always gets in the way. And so my hope is that by working with the WHO, that you guys are able to accelerate that process quite significantly.
Yes, exactly. And it's just, the way that you fight bad information is with good information, and going through the proper, the proper scientific process to be able to develop. Because, with science, we're building evidence, right? And that's what we need to do. We have tons of anecdotal evidence. We've got tons of historical evidence, but it was really the scientific evidence, or the lack thereof, right? It's, on the toxicity side, that really created the overwhelming amount of of inertia that was needed to really get some of these regulatory processes in place. Most countries around the world, Germany lifted its kava ban back in 2014.
Hmm.
Most countries in the world have either lifted their bans or in the process of lifting their bans. There's still some issue. Australia has been kind of slow to it. Canada's been kind of slow to it. Netherlands have been a little bit slow. Of course, you can still get it in, but it's sort of in this gray area process where it's
Yep.
like it's never been like a Schedule 1 substance, of course, because it's not a substance of abuse at all. And it just was like certain preparations, traditional prep, and a couple of these countries, like the bags of it you can sell, you can't sell extracts, and sometimes it'll get stopped, sometimes it won't, so it's like but in most places around the world, the US, it was grandfathered in under the Shea Act of 1994,
Hmm.
Dietary, Food and Supplement Act. So it's considered a dietary supplement. We're getting food classification for these in the future for these things. And so that's a whole other thing. The UK is one that there's some challenges as well too, but most countries around the world, it's completely fine, at this point. So it's moving. It's just taking time. Let's put it this way. It's in a way better position than cannabis and CBD are, and the CBD market is doing amazing. Of course, it's exploding, almost bigger than anything we've ever
Yeah, I
seen.
just wish people would produce better quality CBD. But that's going to be an issue in the future. You mentioned a word earlier, and we're going to kind of, for the audience listening to this, there was a couple of words that Cameron mentioned that I'm going to pick apart. We're going to go delve into those a little bit. You said cavalactones, and people listening to this are like, "Oh, I thought we were talking about kava kava." And so kavalactones, my understanding is that sort of, would I look at that as the active ingredient? And if so, can we explain what kavalactones are, what the differences are between, and what some of the benefits maybe each have?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So Kavalactones, just like cannabinoids in cannabis, right? Whenever we think about cannabis, we think about this array of active constituents. The effects of it, just like I alluded to earlier, the entourage effect, the combination of all the different constituents that make up the full therapeutic action of the plant, are due to this class of compounds. Like in cannabis, there's over 200 or so uh, 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 cannabinoids and several supportive constituents. With kava, the most active constituents are these kavalactones, and they're lipid-like compounds. Lactones are lipid-like compounds that come to the surface of the traditional brew, that kind of give it this gloss, and it's sort of this oil gloss that sort of comes to the top. There are 18, well, there's actually 19 now, total known kavalactones, which we think that there may be more, but the ones that have been isolated and identified, we know of 19, 6 of which produce the overwhelming majority of the effects that kava has become so famous for. So the main one that's been studied the most is one called kavain,
Hmm.
and then there's dihydrokavain, which is a double bonded form of kavain. Then there's one called methysticin. There's one called dihydromethysticin, a double bonded form of that. And then there's one called yangonin. And then there's one called desmethoxyangonin. So these are the primary 6 that elicit most of the effects that we know to be so great with kava. Now, that being said, a lot of people, whenever we look at kavalactones, and I mean, we do kavalactone analysis on all the products that we produce, to try to give people a percentage, a total kavalactone percentage, and even what's called a chemotype, which is like 6-digit number sequence that gives us the ratios.
So,
Puts
so
them
you're
in.
effectively like sequencing the kava plant. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. It's a
A
chemotype.
quality
It
assurance.
gives us, right, exactly. I mean, it gives us a 6-digit number sequence of each kavalactone is assigned a numerical value 1 through 6. And you put them in order based on the concentrations in relation to each other. So you get a general idea of the ratios and the amounts of each one, and it varies per strain. So if you get a chemotype from a specific strain from Vanuatu that happens to be more of a sedating strain versus one from Tonga that happens to be more of a social enhancing strain, more of a daytime strain, then you can look at the chemotype and get a general idea of what the effects might be. But the problem is that there are so many other compounds in kava that aren't accounted for. You could actually have a solvent extract with with a chemotype that's identical to a traditional preparation, and the effects be totally different as far as like the potency and what you can expect to get from it. But
Hmm.
it gives you a ballpark idea, which is really the best we have right now, as to trying to get a total idea of the the effects of kava. Now, total kavalactone percentage is more useful because you have a higher kavalactone percentage, you're going to have a more potent drink. But the ratio thing is not quite as useful in knowing exactly what you're getting. But we're helping to push that process, further in the future to
So
try to
you're
be able
essentially
to.
creating the wine menu of kava.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Because just like with cannabis, there are hundreds of different strains of kava. Some are more daytime, some are more nighttime. Some showcase more of kava's nootropic, mood boosting, cognitive enhancing effects and are not sedating at all. And some are very heavy and like bedtime sedating type of compounds. Because kava
Hmm.
also has effects on dopamine and stuff as well too, without being addictive. So it's really interesting. So it's important when you get into real kava. Most people don't even have the discussion around different strains of kava. We just see these capsules in the health food store shelf. They just call it kava, and the main reason
Yep.
is because they can't even distinguish between strains because they're getting from one of 5 major brokers in Vanuatu that gets huge bushels in from hundreds of different farmers, and all the strains are mixed together and they can't discern. So you can't get a lot of consistency and effects. When you extract them with solvents, you lose a lot of the effects anyway, so you can't tell the difference. But when we're talking about actually getting into kava medically, like we're talking about with cannabis, strain matters, right? You go to dispensaries, you want to get the right strain, obviously, for the right therapeutic application. So that's something that's really important with kava. But in regards to kavalactones, with our products, we do measure for the chemotype, using HPLC methodology, and we'll actually use HPLC now. And then we also get a total kavalactone content.
Hmm.
And so it does give us that general idea, and it is very helpful, to know that, if we're getting, say, high levels of kavain and yangonin, we're going to have more of the euphoric effects and the anxiolytic effects from the kavain
Hmm.
than we would get, say, from the double bonded, DHK dihydrokavin or dihydromethistikin that are very, very, that extend the half-life of the overall experience and are much more in the body and extremely calming, less in the head and more in the body.
Hmm.
So it helps us know some of these things by looking at chemotype. But the general gist is if you're getting a higher kavalactone content, you're going to have a stronger product. And then you sort of dial it in from there with expertise.
Amazing. This is wow. Thank you so much for going into that. I've even lost my train of thought here. I was so caught up in that moment. Um, and in terms of just, let's talk about some of these percentages of kavalactones, because you've mentioned to me a few times in passing 70% plus kavalactones. What's the remaining percentage? Is it, because I know some people out there are going to be concerned about fillers, right? Because um, in supplements, you can get fillers, and those fillers can actually be more harmful than good. What is the remaining percentage that's not cavalactone?
Right. Yeah. So all the products that we produce, and that was sort of, whenever I got into this whole world of kava and, decided that I was going to start a company and partner with individuals in the islands and get a supply chain in which we could verify individual strains and trace every step of the process and make sure that there wasn't mold growing on things and where we could control it from a quality standpoint. I also had to develop some extraction methods that basically completely paralleled the traditional preparation methodology so that our products could be classified as food grade products and so that we could get that full array of different effects from it. So the extraction process that we use with our process, we have several different forms. We have some forms that are much lower kavalactone percentage that actually sometimes can be stronger than the higher percentage ones, depending on how they're made. But we do have, like, say, like a preparation that comes out in an encapsulatable form, very small volume where we've removed all the water from it after doing the extraction process. And we end up with something that's 70, anywhere from 70 to 95% pure kavalactones. The excess in that, we don't use, any chemicals, we don't use any fillers, we don't use anything. It's the pure kava. What you're getting is you're getting a little bit of the excess kava material in there. You're getting some of the resins and the fibers that are still in there. You're also getting some of the very little of the fibers, but you're getting some of the the flavonoids and, sort of the enzymatic activity and a lot of the other different excess sort of just plant material that comprises the lateral roots and the basal stump that we're using there. So no, there are no fillers that's taking up any of that extra volume there, because there's more to the composition of kava. I mean, kava is like, it's like 40 or something, percent, around 40 something percent starch, and then there's a percentage that's fat, there's a percentage of protein, because it's like a food. So there's more to the overall weight to kava than just the oily complex of kavalactones. Even though the kavalactones is like the special sauce, or the most special sauce, it's still this composition thing. So it really is sort of kind of like a whole food at that point, and that's really what makes up the rest of it. And some of the traditional preparations that aren't concentrated into smaller volumes, like the drinks that we're in the process of producing, they have a much lower kavalactone percentage and much higher on the starch content, much higher on the fat content and on the protein content as well. So you end up with lower kavalactone percentage, but because you have this whole entourage, sometimes that's the strongest form that you'll get it in. But if you want immediate effects, you definitely can benefit from higher kavalactone content, especially if it's still produced through the same method as you would produce the drink. And you can get up to these really high levels of these kavalactones, and still have that extra percentage of supportive constituents that acts as sort of the bedrock that helps increase the bioavailability of these main kavalactones, helps increase the half-life of them, to where we can get this sort of whole depth of the full effects profile that you would expect from a traditional drink.
Noble kava, what is that?
Right. So I mentioned it earlier, just kind of touched on it. So noble kava is a classification term that it comes out of Vanuatu. So it's a classification term that has been given to a specific class of domesticated kava that has been dialed in over thousands of years by planting and replanting and selecting for certain characteristics of certain kava plants. It's been dialed in for daily use, right? So this basic class is, basically, to be classified as noble, it has to meet a certain chemical composition standard. So it has to have a specific chemotype, like I, kind of just touched on. It has to fall within a certain range, and it can't have over a certain level of these extra compounds that are not as egregious as the aerial part compounds, but they're still kind of in the plant's defense system. They're sort of subtly irritating in the more wild forms, and they're called flavocavanes. And they're these little chalcone compounds that actually have therapeutic action in small dosages, and there's a hormetic response. Our body adapts to them, and they upregulate certain hormonal systems if they're in the right ratios with certain other constituents in the plant. But if in the wild forms, in the non-noble forms that haven't been dialed in, they're in higher amounts and the ratios are higher, so you can get side effects. You can get stomach upset. You can get next day grogginess. And we don't even actually know that you can ever get really to a dangerous level with them if you prepare it, traditionally. We know if you have a bunch of flavocavanes and then concentrate them with solvents, you can end up in some egregious territory. But we do know that they give side effects. So these non-noble varieties in the islands, they call them two-day varieties, TUDEI, but really it comes from the words 2 day, because you can get like a 2-day hangover from these sometimes in these kavas that are closer to wild kava. These ones that come straight out that are wild kava, they express high amounts of these flavocavanes, so you get really potent effects because they have high levels of kavalactones as well. But you can only use them really for acute medicinal value, for emergencies or for ceremonies or something. Because if you use them every day, you start to accumulate these stomach side effects, and this sort of it's just not a smooth experience. But the Vanuatuan people have been selecting for the most tolerable ones, and the ones that express lower amounts of these flavocavanes, and they've dialed these in over thousands of years to where now we have this class of kava that is so smooth that meets this chemical composition standard that you can take continuously, virtually without side effects at all, and with very low levels and sometimes no levels of these flavocavanes in them, of these flavocavines. So that's very important. So basically all of our strains that we use, we control every step of the process. We partner with farmers. We started, farms ourselves. where we grow individual strains, where we have a chemotype for each strain. We certify that it's 100% noble kava for daily use. We're not opposed to going into some of the non-noble kavas for acute medicinal value in the future, but right now we're only working with nobles because they're the ones that we know are safe for daily consumption over a long period of time through this traditional preparation methodology. But noble kavas, it's very important for us to make this distinction. I'm not against these other forms of kava, especially for acute medicinal application, but they do need to be separated out, because if people get side effects, we don't want to hurt kava's reputation.
Of course.
We need to know what you're getting, right? And so, noble kava is the class that's going to be under the food classification standard as well and stuff too. So all of our products that we produce are produced with 100% certified noble kava material from individual strains.
Very cool. Cameron, this has been an absolute education. Now, just keeping an eye on time here, I want to transition now into a little bit of final four questions, but just given the level of conversations that we've had before, I'm sure we're going to come back to kava on the show at some points. So let's start with those final four questions. What book has most significantly impacted your life?
Ooh, wow, that's an interesting one. Probably, I could throw out some from I guess from a philosophical standpoint. In regards to plant medicine, I read Christian Rash's Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants, and I know that's kind of like, it's like a full encyclopedia, right? So it's probably like a standard book, but I had a lot of time whenever I was sick, right? So I literally read through this entire thing, and it's probably the most comprehensive overview of the ethnobotanical world, and gives some sort of context to from a philosophical standpoint, the role of psychoactive compounds that manifest through the natural ecology, right? So, everything from extremely potent, psychedelic compounds that have amazing application in certain circumstances, that have changed my life and given me perspective, and really are responsible for the depth and understanding of sort of the ecosystem behind plant medicine, all the way to cannabis, all the way to kava, all the way to more subtle compounds, and just understanding plant pharmacology and just sort of the value of plant medicine, right? And sort of that it comes out of this intelligent living system that is this organism that is the planet, and they're extensions of this world, just like we're extensions of this world, just like an apple is an extension of the apple tree. Like we're not individuals on this world, we're part of an integrated system, which is why these compounds are so compatible with us, because the same intelligence that developed, that our bodies sprung out of, the plants also manifest from that same intelligent network, call it what you will. So I guess that would be just one that comes to mind just off the top of my head, because after spending time in that work, right, which is, it is an encyclopedia, but it's kind of like a extended book as well too. It changed my whole perspective on plant medicine, and I had experiences with psychedelic compounds on top of that, and that really sort of set the stage with everything I do philosophically going forth with plant medicine. So that was a big one for me.
Amazing. What's your top trick for enhancing focus?
Well,
you may be biased, so.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, kava is one of my go-tos as far as a compound that I would take, right? But I mean, I'm a huge advocate for the multi-therapeutic approach. I'm a huge advocate for getting the basics right before you take any supplement or compound, right? I mean, kava is an amazing substance, and there's all kinds of individual amazing substances, but there's no pill or powder or lotion or potion or even amazing plant medicine that's going to undo horrible, life circumstances or horrible, bad habits, basically, right? So horrible dietary habits, lack of movement, right? Lack of good quality sleep, which of course kava helps with, it feeds back into it, of course. But for me, doing everything I can to improve sleep, to improve the lighting conditions in my house, to not eating after a certain time, to getting movement throughout the day to make sure that my circadian rhythms are in line with each other. Keeping my levels of systemic inflammation low. So all those basic things that getting into the sort of like health and wellness biohacking world that people are trying to do to invest in their health to get better performance out of themselves. Both from a from a family standpoint, a business standpoint, everything. I would go to all of those things first. And kava definitely, honestly, I mean, and not just even saying that because it's something that we happen to be talking about. It really is an amazing nootropic compound that has probably the best therapeutic to drawback ratio of any powerful plant medicine that I've ever seen. Like it gives you these amazing benefits without the intolerance, addiction and withdrawal process, but it gives you amazing acute benefits, and it has effects on dopamine as well without being addictive. And it's got this great sort of balance to it, right? There are more powerful compounds that you could take. You could take modafinil. You could take you could take a lot of things that are, well, I wouldn't even necessarily say that they're even better and always more powerful, but you have to take into context, the cost benefit ratio of everything, and is it actually giving to your system? It's that knowledge wisdom thing that I mentioned earlier, right? It's like the wisdom of taking something over a long period of time. So all things considering, and kava is definitely one of my favorite individual compounds. Improving sleep, doing the basics, grounding outside, getting lots of sunlight, getting chemicals and processed foods out of your diet. That is those are all the basics of how you really improve and invest in your health and improve your cognition so that you can bring it in every aspect of your life. And then things like kava are sort of the icing on the cake.
What excites you most about the health world right now?
Right now, we're in this time right now where we're getting a tremendous acceleration and progression of everything from technologies to biotechnologies to even just general intercommunication, human consciousness on the planet. It's a really exciting time because things are moving so fast, and the rate at which they're moving is also accelerating, right? So we're more connected than we ever have been, so we can send and receive information faster than we ever have been before too. So we're able to fast track pretty much everything. Some of the things that are coming out of the field of biotechnologies really excite me. Stem cell medicine really excites me. Certain things, within, anti-senescent drugs, that deal with, senescent cells possibly. There's a lot of things within sort of like the biotechnology sort of circuit around enhancing the body's ability to turn over new cells, to lengthen telomeres, to extend, the human lifespan, that are actually look really promising towards the future at actually really moving the dial, excite me a lot. But what excites me even more is individuals being able to send and receive much more good information that's not compromised, kind of like the story with kava, where people just parrot something that's not based on any objective evidence, and looking at historically what makes sense as well too. So I'm talking about just general health principles, like people getting access to good information that's complete about general approaches to upkeeping this machine that is the human body and the human psyche. Just principles like feast famine cycling, like fasting, like when to eat, when to not, right? There's a time and a place. Context matters there. And you can do so much for your health by just understanding basics of how a human being traditionally and ancestrally has developed to be able to interface with the natural world and all of its cycles and all of its sort of natural compounds. How do we derive energy from our environment in the best ways possible, right? From different forms of food that we consume. So there are a lot of things here that are becoming much more popular, and we're just able to really dive deep on them because we can, like, you and I can communicate from across the world. We can have this podcast. We can have long form conversations. We can unpack the context in this so we can get clarity. I can take that into my own world over here, in which I'm, accelerating things in certain aspects of the space and of the industry, and you do the same, right? So all of this excites me, right? There's so much going out, coming out of the more sort of like, therapy world, and then there's much more coming out of like the lifestyle, sort of, application integration world as well. So it all excites me in answering your question.
Amazing. Cameron, where can people find out more about you, your company, and if they want to get the kava, where can they get it?
Yeah. So you can go to gettruekava.com. It's a good resource for everything, the information. We're just making some renovations to the site, providing pretty much everything that, an individual would need to know. And of course, you can email us if you have any extra adjunctive information about the regulatory status or about the science or specifics on, something more than what the average person would want to know as well. So gettruekava.com is the website. You can find us on Facebook, TRU KAVA page, or at TRU KAVA on Instagram, or at TRU KAVA on Twitter, any of those. So we're on all social media. Just search TRU KAVA and you'll find us. And yeah.
And TRU, just for everybody's edification, is
Oh, yes.
spelled
So it's TRU, not TRUE.
Okay,
Yeah, thank
perfect.
you
So
for that.
gettruekava.com, TRU.
Yes.
Cameron, this has been an absolute pleasure, education, and so many other things. I've enjoyed the conversation a lot, and I need to find a way to get this stuff into the Netherlands. So we're going to have a conversation shortly after this. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely, man. Thanks so much for having me.
To all the superhumans listening out there, you can check this one out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you want. But have an epic day.